So thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Metz, and I am a marketing manager at Brooks Publishing. Today, we are excited to present the strategies for encouraging reading readiness in young children. We're joined with Dr. Howard Goldstein, the Associate Dean for Research of College at the College of Behavioral and Community Sciences at the University of South Florida, and Dr. Elizabeth Kelly, an Assistant Professor of Communication Science and Disorders in the School of Health Professions at the University of Missouri, Columbia. At Brooks Publishing, we have a great community on EdWeb. It's called the Teaching All Students Practical Strategies for Inclusive Classrooms. So make sure you join our community. It's at edweb.net/inclusive education. And we host a lot of great webinars, including this one. Then to get your CE certificate, if you're logged in live with your email address, a link to your CE certificate will be emailed to you the next business day. If you join by phone or if you're watching the recording, you need to take the CE quiz to get your CE certificate. And then again, join the community at edweb.net/inclusive education, and then click on this image to find the CE quiz. And a special offer, Brooks Publishing, we're offering 20% off to all of our webinar attendees if you use the code EdWebHG. And this includes the great products that Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Kelly will be talking to us about. So once again, we are honored to have with us Dr. Howard Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is a certified speech language pathologist and former ASHA Vice President for Science and Research. He's currently the Associate Dean of Research and a Professor of Communication Sciences and Disorders in the College of Behavioral and Community Science at University of South Florida in Tampa. Try saying that 10 times fast. And he is the co-author of the Story Friends Intervention Program. And also he's part of the research-based multi-tiered interventions for language and literacy in early childhood. And he's also the author of Path to Literacy. And then we have Dr. Elizabeth Kelly, and she's a certified speech language pathologist and an assistant professor of communication science and disorders in the School of Health Professions at the University of Missouri, Columbia. She is co-author of the Story Friends Intervention Program, which is a part of the research-based multi-tiered intervention for language and literacy in early childhood family of products designed to boost reading readiness for young children. Now that we got that taken care of, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Goldstein. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, welcome everybody from all over the United States and the world. Beth Kelly and I have worked together for about 8 years now, and we're very happy to talk to you about encouraging reading readiness in young children. It's a topic very near and dear to our heart. We started doing research that was funded by the Institute of Educational Sciences as part of the Center for Response to Intervention in Early Childhood a number of years ago, and continued to do work that's currently funded by the Institute of Educational Sciences. In the context of that research, we've collaborated with teachers and parents and children in multiple states, including Columbus City Schools in Ohio, Kansas City Schools in Kansas City and in Missouri, Hillsborough County School District here in Tampa, Florida, and a few folks in other places in Oregon and Minnesota and so forth. So we've had a lot of experience working with young children, especially in the context of multi-tiered systems of support. So today what we plan on doing is discussing the skills that children need before they learn to read. So our interest has primarily been in the pre-kindergarten year, mainly with 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds as they prepare for kindergarten and beyond. We're going to talk a bit about the skills that children need to be successful in school and how you can tell if children might be struggling with the development of these skills. We're going to provide examples of some of the strategies that we've developed and studied over a period of time and gone through a period of um, examination and refinement and revision and so forth. And then my favorite part is the questions and discussion period at the end. And we also will probably have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the intervention programs that were Jennifer mentioned, Story Friends and Path to Literacy. So from a developmental standpoint, what are the early language and literacy skills that children need, especially if we're thinking about preventing reading disabilities? And I think that one of the um, pivotal points in the history of language development research was in the early 90s, and this book came out in 1995, Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experience of Young American Children. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Betty Hart and Todd Risley wrote a book that was very accessible. I would consider it bedtime reading. You know, you could have it next to your nightstand and get a lot out of reading this book. They talk about the challenges that we weren't unaware of at that time in terms of social class differences in the language experiences of young children. This particular graph actually indicates that they started tracking children monthly at the age of about 12 months up to 36 months. And what they have is trajectories that indicate how many millions of words children are exposed to in what they call professional working class and welfare families at that period of time. And you'll see that there are highly significant differences in the tens of millions between the amount of language exposure children in middle class families might get versus low income families. This trajectory, when you sort of uh, look beyond 36 months to 48 months, when children might be starting Head Start programs or pre-kindergarten programs, are so large that you really don't have enough hours in the day, and especially during a classroom day in early childhood settings, to make up for that difference. So it really made us think differently about the magnitude of the problem of preparing children for school who come from experiences that are very different in some families than other families. The exposures that we're talking about in this particular case had to do with the number of words. And actually, if you looked at the number of words that children knew from these different social classes, it would mirror the number of exposures. So there are large differences there. This has more recently been talked about in terms of the 30 million word gap. So Bridging the Word Gap, for example, is a national research network of folks who are interested in trying to give children more of a head start and trying to diminish this gap early in development, even before the ages that we're primarily talking about. A popular book that came out by Dana Suskind is another very accessible book called 30 Million Words, Building a Child's Brain. So what are the best predictors of reading? In, in part of this simple view of reading, you know, there are certain skills that kind of go together. If you're able to decode the letters of a word and sound out a word, um, that decoding ability is very important. But in order to become a fluent reader, you're really going to need to have the vocabulary that those words map onto. So decoding plus vocabulary together are really critical features of becoming a fluent reader. The early language and literacy domains that we're going to focus on that are highly predictive of later reading abilities kind of fall into alphabet awareness and phonological awareness, or alphabet knowledge and phonological awareness, which are more early literacy skills, and oral language and vocabulary, which are consider our early language skills. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these. In the early literacy area, by alphabet knowledge, we're usually talking about being able to identify letter names and sounds. And in fact, the ability to map letters to sounds or graphemes to phonemes, that letter sound correspondence is critically important to learning how to read. And that knowledge of the alphabetical principle is one of those prerequisite skills. There are some other skills that we consider phonological awareness skills that are more meta-linguistic. If you think about things like segmenting words into syllables and phonemes, and blending word parts or specific sounds or phonemes into whole words, that's another phonological awareness skill. Being able to identify the first parts of different kinds of words, including compound words, two-syllable words, and even single words that we'll give you some examples of. And at the phonemic level, the identification of the first sounds of words in particular. So those are all skills that are really critical to learning how to read. The phonological awareness skills and that knowledge of the alphabetic principle are really the cornerstones to decoding. So these are the skills that are really critical to decoding. So let's give you some examples. Um, I'm not going to hear you, but we'll pretend that I can hear you because all of you are going to respond out loud when I ask you to listen to me say the parts of a word, dough, nut. Now you say the word.
Donut.
That's right, donut. Beth, you got it right. Okay, so that would be an example of blending parts of a word together, in this case, a compound word. Okay, listen. Monkey. Now you say the parts of the word and stretch them out. And I'm sure you said monkey, or you could have said n, e. Either one of those would be examples of segmenting words into their parts. Okay, now I want you to tell me the first part of the word, listen, party. And you could have said par, you could have said part. You might have even said p, which would have been the first sound of the word. Let's give you another example. Let's pretend I have a bone. Unfortunately, I don't have a bone here. Um, but I'm going to switch this one up. Can you see this? Look, this is a knife. What's the first sound you hear in knife?
Mm,
And I'm
mm.
sure you all said and you didn't say k, right? So that would be an example of the first sound identification. Now, if we think about these early literacy and language skills, you might wonder, what are ways that we can tell if a child is struggling? And oftentimes, what we've done is put together um, a number of characteristics that kind of map onto, bigger constructs around oral language skills. And what I want you to think about is among the children that might be in your pre-K classroom, preschool classroom, do children use these various concepts or constructs, characteristics, let's say, never, rarely, often, or always? So just sort of discriminating based upon, how often do they use these particular skills. So the first one is using simple grammatically correct sentences. So, for example, you would have correct sentences where there's no pronoun confusion or no verb tense errors or word order reversals. The second characteristic would be producing sentences that contain a variety of words, including nouns, verbs, modifiers, such as adjectives. A third one is telling short, understandable narratives, either about personal events or retelling simple stories. Another example is identifying and labeling most of the common objects in a classroom. Do they have basic vocabulary or core vocabulary? Can they correctly select a toy or an object when it's described using color or location or other descriptors like size, big or small, things like that? Some additional oral language skills is being able to categorize vocabulary, naming words that belong to categories such as vehicles, animals, or toys. Can children follow 2 or 3-step directions in preschool? Can they answer explicit who, what, where, when, and how questions? And probably the more advanced skill is understanding implicit questions that require inferencing or predicting what's happening in stories. Likewise, we can think about how often do children demonstrate some of these emergent literacy skills, like identifying and naming all the letters from their name, naming the letters of the alphabet, and then more importantly, identifying the sounds associated with the letters. Are they able to identify words that rhyme? Those are emerging literacy skills. More advanced phonological awareness skills include matching words that start with the same sound, blending parts of words to make whole words, knowing how to hold and follow along with a book. So positioning a book, turning the pages, knowing to read from left to bottom in English and top to bottom, left to right and top to bottom. Um, some early writing skills like pretending to write and what looks like letters to form words. Those are all emergent literacy skills. Another set of characteristics that we also take a look at in terms of tiers of support in, and whether children might um, be on target, whether they might be suitable for extra instruction that incorporates small groups of instruction or maybe individualized instruction. So can children follow directions without the need for frequent prompting? Instruct directions like keeping their hands to themselves. Do they require multiple teaching strategies to learn something new, like extra modeling or prompting, rep repeated practice, rephrasing of questions or instructions, the use of manipulatives? So those additional teaching strategies that we often use when we're individualizing instruction. Do children need a high level, or a particular child need a high level of positive verbal reinforcement to complete a task? How well do they do with transitions between preferred and non-preferred activities? Do they cooperate with peers? Do they share and take turns, waiting for turns, and so forth? Do they initiate social interaction with peers adequately? So these are 3 sets of global skills: language skills, literacy skills, and behavioral skills that might give us an indication whether children are falling behind. And often when you do this with a classroom with a simple rating scale, um, which we provide in some of our curricular materials, you can tell which kids seem to be falling behind in certain areas. And, oftentimes you're not expecting to have more than, 3 children or especially in the early literacy area, who are falling behind their peers. Maybe more children may have problems with vocabulary skills depending upon the socioeconomic economic status in the school where you're operating and so forth. The idea behind this is to sort of think about this as in terms of a decision-making framework. The idea behind this, our goal is to identify the children that need extra support. And the way that we do that is we first screen. We, can do this through a number of the kinds of assessments that you find in your classrooms already, or even a simple checklist that would be made up of the kinds of characteristics that we just talked about. If the children are doing fine, they're often or always demonstrating most of these skill areas, then you don't have to spend a whole lot of time monitoring their progress further because they seem to be meeting the expectations that go along with their peer group. But for children for whom you have concerns and that seem to be falling, following, falling behind, then you would probably want to monitor progress more frequently, let's say monthly or every 3 weeks or something, to sort of see whether they're learning phonological awareness skills. Many of the children have no exposure to those kinds of tasks until they get to preschool. And, over the course of the first few months of school, those kids may start picking up those skills as long as they're being addressed in the classroom. We need to think about how we prioritize developmental domains. You know, Oftentimes I sort of think about, do they have some of the behavioral prerequisites to be able to benefit from instruction? Do they have the language skills so that when you're talking about more meta-linguistic skills, such as phonological awareness entails, that may be later developing for those children who don't have the basic language skills. And then ultimately, what we want to think about is what is the trajectory that these children are demonstrating um, throughout their preschool year, because we want them to be able to meet the benchmarks as they begin kindergarten. So we have a decision-making framework that's based around identifying children who are in need as quickly as we can. We screen the children to determine who are the kids that we need to pay more attention to. For those children, we monitor their progress, we prioritize their needs and what kinds of tiers of extra support they need, and hopefully get kids who are falling behind caught up as quickly as possible. Ways in which we do that have to do with some teaching strategies, and Beth is going to start talking about those, um, I believe, at this point. And Beth, you may have seen some questions that popped up that um, that we that you may want to embellish at this point, or we can wait till later. I wasn't able to watch those at the
Yeah,
same
I
time.
think Jen's keeping track of them for us. So maybe we'll just see if I touch on any of it, and then we'll come
Okay,
back to it a little bit. So
great.
what we want to talk with you about at this point are some strategies for teaching. So when we are specifically thinking about those students who are struggling, if we've looked at our decision-making framework and we found some children who seem to be falling behind, what are the strategies that we're going to use to teach those struggling learners? And what we wanted to focus on today were a couple of strategies that are evidence-based strategies that are effective across domains, so that work well, whether you're working on early literacy skills, oral language skills, anything across that. So we're going to focus on two things in this next little section. The first strategy we want to talk about is teaching explicitly, and then we want to talk about some key strategies to improve instruction. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of teaching explicitly. And I want to explain it thinking about incidental learning versus explicit teaching. So incidental learning is something that all good teachers and SLPs are doing when you create opportunities for kids to learn these oral language and early literacy skills from natural interactions in the environment. We know that children are very good at learning from their environment. You guys have all experienced about this. A lot of this learning takes place through these incidental natural interactions. For example, we know that we have kids who use new words just by hearing adults use them. In contrast, and also with print or early literacy, kids start learning how print works just by being exposed to books. So some of those skills Howard talked about turning pages and paying attention to print, doing nursery rhymes. Those are all examples of more incidental learning. What we want to focus on for children who are struggling is this explicit teaching. So for explicit teaching, this is when teachers, SLPs, specialists are taking the time to provide really specific, direct instruction on these language and early literacy skills. So while both incidental learning and explicit teaching matter, for kids who are struggling, this explicit teaching is particularly important to help them meet those benchmarks and be on a trajectory that's going to get them caught up. So we want to make sure that we're providing explicit teaching beyond those general naturalistic opportunities. The good news is that we have a lot of evidence to guide our teaching when we want to do this teaching explicitly. There's a strong evidence base both in the domains of oral language and phonemic awareness. When we make these interventions explicit, when we're teaching them directly, children learn more. We see them go on to be better readers than when we have interventions that are more general. Particularly in the area of vocabulary, our research builds on a large body of research that has shown that children learn more words and they learn more about those words. They develop deep knowledge when our teaching is explicit, when we take the time to really stop and teach vocabulary rather than just expose children to language. So we're going to talk here about a couple of examples of ways that you could incorporate that explicit teaching. And so one of the examples I want to talk about is a way that you can make sure you're doing explicit vocabulary instruction when you're sharing storybooks. So when you read a book to children, it's a valuable experience. You're creating lots of opportunities for that incidental learning of language. But for children who are struggling, you want to make sure that you're providing explicit teaching. So that means that you're going to stop and talk about vocabulary words during the story. You want to make sure that you are taking the time to really teach those words. And I think I have an example here about some of the ways that you might include some of these components. One thing that we found to be really valuable for the kids that we work with across studies is to make sure that we're providing a simple, child-friendly definition. So if I'm teaching the word enormous, I teach enormous means really big. Using a child-friendly definition, using words that the child already has in their vocabulary. For a word like protect, we might say protect means to keep you safe. So that child-friendly definition helps the child incorporate that new word using words they already know. Another thing to incorporate in this explicit teaching is using some examples from the story. So good storybooks provide a nice strong context for that new vocabulary word. You're going to pick words that have a strong context. So using some examples from the story to explain what that word means. And the third piece that should be part of that explicit teaching is making connections between the child's vocabulary word, the child's life and that new vocabulary word. The chat function is so interesting. I want to keep turning and looking at it, so I have to focus what I'm supposed to be saying. So making connections between that child's life experience. Isabel Beck, who has done a lot of work in this area, talks about how you want to create some meaning for that new word in the child's life so that it becomes a word that's going to be useful and important in their own experiences. Here's a little example of what that explicit teaching might look like. It sounds like a lot to incorporate, but you can do this in a brief embedded lesson as you read the story. So the word that I'm using here as an example is this word disappointed. And this is a word that's a pretty sophisticated vocabulary word, but this is just the type of word, this word disappointed, protect, enormous. These are the kinds of words that children who are struggling in the domain of oral language don't usually know. This is a word that's going to be useful to them, both in academic situations, as well in conversation, in their lives, maybe for understanding a specific story. Isabel Beck talks about these as being these tier 2 words. So although this is a sophisticated vocabulary word, it's an important vocabulary word. And you can see this instruction is explicit. So we'll say, oh no, Tanya's disappointed. Disappointed means sad. There's our child-friendly definition. She thought her friends were coming to the party and they didn't come. There's our connection to the story, using the example from the story to reinforce what that word means. Now she's disappointed. You say it, disappointed. Giving a child an opportunity to say that word, to start to really hold on to that word. She is sad. And then here we have a chance to make a connection between our new word and the child's life. So yesterday we were disappointed because it was raining and we couldn't go outside. We were sad. We were disappointed. So what I think is important about this example is that you can see the child's hearing the word quite a bit. She's hearing the definition quite a bit. She's getting an opportunity to say the word. There's meaningful connections both to the story and to the child's life. So this is the kind of explicit teaching that can really support struggling learners. Now, one thing I want to emphasize here, and this is something that we have certainly found in our own experiences and our own research, as well as drawing on all the great research and teachers that we've interacted with, is that this kind of explicit teaching is not the kind of thing you can do on the fly. This requires planning. It requires a really supportive curriculum, choosing good books, choosing good words, designing that instruction isn't the kind of thing, it's something that takes a lot of practice and a lot of planning. And I have a little note here that Howard might want to jump in and tell a little bit about why this requires so much planning ahead.
On a number of occasions, I've had the opportunity to do workshops with preschool teachers, and I ask them to bring one of the books from their classroom that their children enjoy. And then I select one from the audience and I say, I'm going to read this book to you. And while I read it, I want you to write down all the words that I'm pretty confident that most of the children would not know or be able to define. And I read the book, which is always a great fun thing to do. And we get done, and I ask the audience, how many words did you write down? And inevitably, you have a range of between 10 and 20 words. And I say, would you teach all 15 words or whatever? They said, oh, no, that's too many. So I said, well, how many would be a good number? And they said, well, maybe, 4 or 5. And then I said, okay, look at your list. How are you going to select the 4 or 5 out of your 15 or so? And it takes them a while to generate the ideas about, what would be the best words to teach out of that particular list. And then I say, okay, I want you to just pick 2 words, and I want you to write child-friendly definitions for those 2 words. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do this. And at the end of the 2 minutes, inevitably people say, I just need a little bit more time. And it really made me realize that this is not something that many teachers can do on the fly. This takes planning in order to select words, come up with child-friendly definitions, think about multiple contexts for providing extra information about the words and how they're used in context and so forth. This is actually a pretty difficult task when you're actually trying to teach vocabulary in the context of just reading a storybook to children.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that many of you have had that same experience. And I think the thing we just want to point out here is that this is the kind of thing you just need to plan ahead for, that explicit teaching of vocabulary is going to take looking ahead at the words that you want to teach and making a plan for those definitions in particular. Okay. So that's just one example of how you might incorporate explicit teaching, using that example of shared storybook reading as a way to teach it. The other, strategy we want to share, and again, this is an evidence-based practice that works across instructional domains, is this idea that for our struggling learners, we really need to improve our instruction. So we're not only going to provide more instruction for those children, we're going to think about ways to make that instruction better and more effective. So that can include increasing the number and frequency of practice opportunities, and also increasing our intensity by focusing on the most targeted, most important set of skills. Again, this is an evidence-based practice. We have lots of studies that have shown that when we take children and provide more vocabulary instruction, they learn more words. And in a lot of these studies, maybe there's large classroom, the whole classroom's getting some vocabulary instruction, and then we take those struggling readers and provide them with some additional small group instruction. We have also seen that when we provide intense early literacy instruction, we see improvements in early literacy skill more rapidly. So there's a lot of reason for us to think about improving our instruction by just providing some more instruction. But that instruction can't just be more of the same. Those struggling readers are likely going to need some different combinations. So adding some small group or some one-on-one instruction is going to be one of the things that we want to consider. We also want to think about how we can increase our intensity within that instructional time. So we only have a finite amount of time to work with. How can we ensure that the instructional time is being used most effectively? One of the things that we'll want to consider here are providing more opportunities to practice, more teaching trials, more opportunities for those kids to respond. So if we take it from the large group to the small group, each of those children in the small group is going to have more chances to respond. We can provide more examples. We can think of how can we repeat and really focus in on what those kids are struggling in and provide feedback that's specific to what that child needs. We might also think about how can we be strategic in how we time up those additional sessions. Could we provide multiple sessions in a day or in a week where we've worked on those focused skills? We might do some teaching in a large group and then do a small group. One of the things that we learned working with teachers was that some of them found it to be very effective to do small group instruction with the children that they thought were likely to struggle prior to the large group. And one potential advantage of doing that pre-instruction with your small group is that those students then in the large group are more likely to experience some success in the large group. I had one teacher in particular explain to me that she would do small group vocabulary instruction with her children who are likely to struggle before she read the storybook and did her vocabulary instruction in the large group. And that those children who were usually the ones to struggle then got to be the ones who could raise their hand, who could answer, who could sort of be the star and experience some success. And just how important that was for those children who typically struggle to learn in those larger group settings. So again, when we think about improving our instruction, it's not just more, it's thinking carefully about how to do more. Another way we can think about improving our instruction to really help those struggling learners is to really focus on key skills. So those children who are struggling, it's going to be harder for them to learn some of these skills. So we want to make sure that we are focusing on those skills that have been identified as being really critical for language and early literacy success. And Howard talked some about those. The skills, the phonemic awareness skills, the letter sound correspondence skills, they're going to be critical for decoding. And then also vocabulary. So how can we boost their vocabulary, teaching words that are important, teaching words that are likely to be useful to them in the classroom and at home. Another way we might think about increasing our intensity specific for phonemic awareness is maybe focusing, narrowing in on a small set of sounds at first for phonemic awareness, giving lots of practice, lots of examples using those sounds so that children can establish that phonemic awareness skill before we broaden to include all the sounds. So these are some ways that we might really improve our instruction and help those kids who are struggling. On the next slide here, I just want to show a quick example of what that really targeted phonemic awareness instruction might look like. And what I think is important about this example is it shows how much explicit instruction, but also how much feedback the instructor is providing. So this is a scripted example here. The examiner would say, listen, holding up her fingers, rooster. Say the parts of the word rooster with me and hold up your fingers. So using those visual cues, helping kids thinking about that. Now you say the part of the word and hold up the first, excuse me. You say the first part of the word and hold up one finger. And you can see here now there's some opportunities for the instructor to provide feedback based on what that child does. So the child gets it right, great. We're going to say yes, Rue, and reinforce that correct response. The child doesn't get it correct or doesn't respond, we have the opportunity to provide that instruction again, but also add some support, add some scaffolding that's going to help that child get to that targeted skill. So just to kind of wrap this up a little bit, this section, when we think about supporting struggling learners, a couple of things we might want to make sure we're doing is teaching explicitly. So not only providing a lot of high quality incidental learning experiences, but making sure that we're teaching language and literacy skills explicitly and directly. We also want to think about, for those children who are struggling, we need to improve our instruction. So that's increasing dosage, that's doing more, but it's also being more effective with that time and focusing on the most important skills. So Howard, did you have anything you wanted to add in that section there?
Actually, I was kind of monitoring a number of the comments. So why don't
Okay.
we open it up for question and answer, and then we can hit upon some of the questions that people had. So, um, Jen, do you want me to hit on some of these, or do you want to
Um,
take over?
well, the one that I saw the most was asking about pre-teaching vocabulary. So it seemed a few people in the chat wanted to know if it was more valuable to pre-teach vocabulary or teach it while reading.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question because we have assumed that pre-teaching vocabulary might be a good thing to do. So we actually did a little experiment on that, and we in the context of Story Friends, which we haven't really talked very much about, we found that Story Friends alone was basically as effective as when we did pre-teaching of the words, these pretty challenging words that are incorporated into the story context, which was somewhat surprising to us, but very few children actually benefited from that pre-teaching of vocabulary. Um, but I think it's important to realize that when we introduce vocabulary in the context of stories and do our little embedded lesson, it involves having the children say the words and to um, repeat the definitions, and we provide context that relate to the children's life, um, and often another context as well. So it's really a pretty interactive, quickly paced part of what goes on, and that alone seems to be quite effective. If you don't have those features, I'm sure the pre-teaching would work, but you can also do it in the context of actually reading the story, at least in in at least the way that we do it within Story Friends. There have
Okay,
there were all there was
sorry.
also a question about children learning from context,
hmm
and when you have challenging words, um, it's rare for children to simply um, get the words and being able to understand them well enough to define them from the context. Even if there's um, a picture that's pretty concrete that relates to the word and so forth, um, it, it's actually been shown not only with preschoolers but also with older children. When you have more advanced words, context alone rarely is sufficient.
Okay, and how about we answer about one more question, and then I want to move on to talk about the exciting products.
Mhm.
Okay, so I have um, someone wanted to know how to manage the time if every time I have to stop to explain new words.
Yeah, it really needs to be quickly paced, but it's hard to do that unless you have it planned out beforehand. What the definition is, um, you know, when we've able to kind of get around the problem of children taking turns, which is what really slows things up, by actually having pre-recorded stories, and that allows us to have children responding at the same time to the narrator who's doing the lessons sort of within the context of reading the story.
Well, I think that's a
That'll
great.
become clearer in a section, when we kind of show off story prints a little bit.
Yep, I said I think that's the perfect segue to
Yeah,
our next slides.
yeah.
All right. So, Dr. Kelly, I believe you're going to be speaking about story friends.
Sure,
So
I
I'll
can
turn
talk
it over.
about this.
All right, so I'll turn it over to you.
So I think that one of the things we wanted to make sure we talked about today was that this is really hard to do. Providing effective, explicit vocabulary instruction, it's a challenging thing to do. And what we've been working to do is to create a program that provides that rich, embedded, explicit instruction without placing a lot of additional demands on teachers and SLPs. So we've been working on this for a while. And the program that we've developed is called Story Friends. And so Story Friends has been designed as a tier 2 intervention for those preschool children who are struggling. So we're seeing that they're at risk for reading difficulties because they have really limited oral language. So we've designed some storybooks. You can see the jungle friends and the forest friends here. And the way that this program works is that children are going to listen to these storybooks, and we've embedded these explicit vocabulary lessons. And these are really brief, engaging lessons, just to kind of. So I know that somebody was thinking about what's the time sort of on this, and what we found is that we were able to provide instruction on a couple of challenging vocabulary words and a couple of concept words within the context of the story, and they're about 11 minutes long. So they fit into what we consider kind of a typical center rotation, or about a small group instructional time. We teach in Story Friends concept words, so things like tall and short. We know those are important vocabulary words for children in pre-K. These are places that a lot of kids will struggle. But we also really focus on those words that are those challenging words, those more sophisticated words that kids are not likely to learn without some explicit instruction. We also make sure to pick words that are likely to be useful for those kids. So they're going to show up again in the classroom. They're going to show up again in conversation, and they're going to be important down the line for reading comprehension. So here is an example of teaching the word protect. Embedded in this story is also, there's opportunities to answer comprehension questions. And Howard mentioned when he was talking about the different skills that we might be paying attention to identify struggling learners, is this idea of answering inferential questions. And we see that kids who are at risk of later reading difficulties seem to struggle with these inferential questions. So why did the jungle friends laugh at Ellie? The way that Story Friends is structured is that small groups of children, usually 3, participate in listening centers. They follow along in a specially designed storybook. You can see that here. They're listening under headphones to pre-recorded audio that not only reads the story, but provides those brief, explicit, embedded lessons. So as they're listening to the story, these are pre-K students, right? So they're not reading yet. As they're listening to the story, our narrator, Wanda the Word Wolf, will interrupt the story and provide a brief, explicit lesson about one of those target words. Oh, I'm sorry, I went the wrong direction. One of the things that we tried to really work on is making sure that Story Friends would be easily implemented in classroom settings. So what that means is that it's designed to fit into a typical center rotation. As I mentioned, they're about 11 minutes long. Also, because all of the instruction is provided under headphones by the pre-recorded audio, there's not additional demands placed on the teachers. You don't have to pick out the books and the words and design the lessons. The program has done that work for you, and we've tried it out with lots of different kids to make sure that it works. Okay, sorry, that's the last slide, I guess, for Story Friends. This next thing takes you to Paths to Literacy. Howard, what else do you want to add about Story Friends here?
It sort of struck me on the example of our challenging word being protect. And the other word that was in there in that sentence, I don't know if you want to go back to it, with Pablo the porcupine, it was quills. Why would you pick protect over quills?
So
Because most children, yeah, I wanted people to sort of think about that.
sure.
But go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I thought you were asking me.
Ah, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so one of the things that we really have emphasized is again, those
Huh.
words that are likely to be useful, to show up again, and a word that's likely to require a lot of instruction. So quills is something that you could teach pretty quickly, right? You could show a picture, you could explain it without a lot of instruction, and kids would be able to learn it. It's also not a word that's going to show up maybe as often as a word like protect or enormous across contexts. For a word like protect, that's a word that a kid's going to need some instruction on to learn, particularly for these struggling kids. A couple of things that showed up here in the side is repetition seems to be important, and that's something we've included in this program. So the way the program is designed is that children listen multiple times across days. So they listen to the books usually 3 times. But then also within each storybook, there's an embedded lesson during the story. And then immediately after the story, they listen to another short lesson about the word. So they're getting lots of exposure. So we talked about strategies that support struggling learners, increasing the dosage, but also being very strategic about what that dosage looks like. So they get to practice it during the storybook and then right after. So within that 11 minutes, they're getting multiple lessons on the words. And then in a week, they're getting multiple lessons. There was also a quick question that said, has this worked? And we do have a lot of data to support this program. And the majority of our work has been done in preschool classrooms, working with children who have limited language. So these are kids who are struggling. We also have done some work, somebody asked about English language learners, and we've included English language learners in our samples and seen good effects for those students. I will say for some of them, they seem sort of slow to start as they start to acquire English, and then they increase as they get some of the sort of basic vocabulary. They're ready to learn these more advanced words.
Yeah, if those children don't have kind of a core vocabulary, would have a hard time, for example, labeling things that are in the classroom in English, then they probably aren't going to understand the stories and the definitions and so forth. So um, when we talk about English language learners, we're talking about children who've had sufficient exposure to English to get to the point where they can benefit from the stories. The other thing that you talked about is the practice component. And, that's a really important feature of having these children wearing the headphones and being able to respond at the same time. And as the picture showed, there were groups of 3 children and an adult. The adult doesn't do a whole lot, because the instruction is pre-recorded, and the story is pre-recorded, but they keep the children on the same page. They provide some encouragement. You know, they might gesture to a child and, to try to get them to speak up if they're not responding or what have you. And I think it's all about opportunities to respond. I just don't know anything that is more important than opportunities to respond as a predictor of learning across many domains. So
All
let me
right,
just
Howard,
mention,
I think they're ready for you to talk about path to literacy.
yeah, I
Um,
know, I kind of got that
yes.
hint
Um,
too.
Hi. So this is Jen. Um, we could talk probably for hours about story friends, but
Uh-huh.
in the chat box, I'm going to be posting the link to Brooks Publishing, and we have a whole story friends section that goes into the research and provides samples. So I'm putting that in our chat right now.
Okay.
All right. So let's move
So
on
let
to
me
Pat.
tell you a little bit about Path to Literacy. This was developed at the same time, and it focuses on alphabet knowledge and phonological awareness. It again is one of these programs that is designed as a tier 2 intervention for children who are falling behind in early literacy skills and they're getting supplemental instruction in small groups of 3 children typically. It's a scripted lesson that we typically have taught paraprofessionals or aides in the classroom to do, um, thinking that our teachers are more consumed with doing the general instruction and more tier 3 instruction for kids that need individualized instruction. The lessons are interactive, game-like. The children get feedback contingent upon the group's responses, not on um, just on individuals' responses. So the example of Rooster, those responses were correct, no response, or incorrect. So basically, if any of the children get an incorrect response, then the whole longer prompt is provided to provide additional feedback. But if you have one child who doesn't respond, then they get then the whole group gets feedback that was designed for non-responders. And of course, if everybody's responding correctly, the program goes even that much quicker. It teaches 5 skill areas and progresses through some typically 3 lessons per unit. So I'll show you those in a second. But this is basically an example of a standard treatment protocol designed for Tier 2 instruction. Hmm. So this sort of shows you our scope and sequence. So we have blending, segmenting, the identification of first parts of words and first sound of words. We also have alphabet knowledge. With these letters are the ones that we introduce. They happen to be letters that have the same sound correspondence in English and in Spanish. And you'll see in lesson 1, we're doing blending compound words, 2-syllable words, and by lesson 2, we're starting to do segmenting of 2-syllable words, and well, that's 3, and 2 was segmenting compound words. There's a little bit of overlap as we progress through the scope and sequence. So in essence, this instructional program is typically delivered in 12 weeks, 3 days per week is sufficient for children to demonstrate quite good progress in phonological awareness. And actually, I'll show you some results in just a second. It is targeting children who have at least basic English language skills that allow them to follow directions, to name some common objects in English, um, and are able to comprehend the lessons. We also monitor children through the fall typically, because if children haven't been exposed to these phonological awareness skills, they often will pick them up on their, through the general classroom instruction. But if we have children um, who aren't able to identify first sounds or do rhyming, and we've used these individual growth and development indicators for progress monitoring purposes, and these 2 Dibbles measures, first sound fluency and word part fluency, they take basically a minute to 2 minutes to administer each of these subtests. But those allow us to monitor progress and see what kind of growth the children are demonstrating. For children who aren't demonstrating adequate improvement, then those are the children that we've targeted. Um, Children are providing the 12 to 15 responses per lesson, answering questions, repeating prompts, pointing to pictures, doing this gestures, all of which is scripted out for the teacher or the aide easily to be able to follow. It typically takes about 10 minutes. If you have children at the beginning of the week who are struggling, it might take a little bit longer. Um, but we recommend doing it 3 times per week, which allows you to do the 3 lessons per unit. Children are receiving immediate feedback based upon their responses. They have lots of opportunities to respond, get feedback. Um, And because we have parallel lessons per unit, it really does triple the opportunities to respond. And we collect a little bit of data at the end of each lesson to sort of see whether they're getting those skills. So our ultimate curriculum-based measure that we focused on is first sound fluency, which is a Dibbles measure that has a benchmark for the beginning of kindergarten of 10. So if children in a minute can identify the first sound in words um, 10 times within a minute, it is 1 minute, right? You remember that, Beth?
I
I
think
think it's a
so.
minute. Yeah. Um, and you'll see in Path to Literacy, and this was our comparison group, were the children that were identified because they were low in these early literacy skills. So we gave them instruction on Story Friends so that they would be getting something beneficial, but not something that was focusing on early literacy. They look at identical at pre-test, but look at these huge differences at post-test. And this 14.8 on average for first sound fluency is higher than the benchmark of 10. And I think it represents about 85% of our children are reading demonstrating the benchmark for the beginning of kindergarten. It even goes up a little higher after a maintenance period. So once they develop these skills, they tend not to lose them. So story friend kids, you know, even though they weren't getting explicit instruction through Path to Literacy, there's some instruction going on in the classroom most likely. You know, they're picking up on these skills, but they're not, the kids that are low stay low. They're not ready for kindergarten or not demonstrating those kindergarten readiness skills. So that's our overview of these two products. Jen, do you want to say something about this?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Kelly. So what I wanted to talk about real quick is that Brooks Publishing, we're offering a Story Friends product preview where we would introduce the Story Friends intervention to an early childhood program. The programs would receive a classroom kit, the Story Friends classroom kit, which is pictured on the right of the slide, and it's for a 3-month trial period. If you're interested, you would contact Robert Miller at rmiller@brookspublishing.com. And that's a great opportunity to try the Story Friends intervention. And then I just wanted to give another thank you. So thank you to Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Kelly. This was such a great webinar, a lot of useful information. So we definitely appreciate you participating with us. And then for the CE certificate, if you logged in live with your email address, a link to your CE certificate will be emailed to you the next business day. If you joined by phone or you're watching the recording, you need to take the CE quiz to get your certificate. And then make sure to join our community at edweb.net /inclusive education. And then join our group for Brooks Publishing. It's teaching all students practical strategies for inclusive classrooms. And then also, I know we ended a little quick, but make sure you check out brookspublishing.com for information on Story Friends and Path to Literacy. I'll stay on for a little to record any questions that we may have, and then I'll send them over to Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Kelly, and then we can post the answers to those in our EdWeb community. So again, thank you very, very much.
Thank you for hosting, Jen. This was fun.
Thanks.